Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. So today I'm joined by Dr. Christine Bao, an assistant professor in the University of Colorado's Anschutz Center for Bioethics and Humanities. Christine's work focuses on acute and chronic health implications of repetitive brain injury from sport and the resultant individual, institutional, policy, and ethical considerations. She was named a Forbes 30 under 30 in sports, and she also studies risk, decision making, and morality in sports. Christine, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
You have such an interesting research portfolio. There's so many different ways we can go with this, but tell us a little bit how this portfolio evolved.
Sure. It really began with my first job out of college. I was working at the Boston University Center for the study of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, where a lot of the modern work around this disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, a neuropathologic disease that comes from repetitive head impacts, originated. And it was all very kind of lucky and by circumstance that I ended up there. But it got me thinking a lot about brain injury from sport. It got me thinking even more broadly about kind of the public health or policy implications of all of the youth, adolescent, collegiate, and professional athletes in the United States. And so I've kind of taken it a bunch of directions from there, thinking about this from the policy angle, thinking about it from the epidemiologic side, and just trying to kind of contextualize whose roles and responsibilities it is to care for, protect, and ensure the safety of athletes across all levels. And so my work in some ways is a little bit scattered. I touch upon a lot of different issues, but all kind of focused on, the health and well-being of athletes.
That's fascinating. And when you went to BU, did you know that that's what you were going to be doing, or was it just, hey, I'm just sort of interested in this topic and let me see if I like it?
I ended up at BU because I had a crisis of conscience and I didn't know what I wanted to do out of college. I thought I was going to go to law school. And then I changed my mind and had to find a job in April of my senior year of college. So it really was very kind of happenstance. And I was a research coordinator there. So nothing fancy, just working with a really strong interdisciplinary team of scientists who were at the forefront of, like I said, the kind of modern work on this issue, clinically, neuropathologically, et cetera. And so from there, I just got inspired both by the scientists, but also by my interactions with current and former National Football League players, military veterans, other professional or elite athletes who would come into my office as part of our research work and have these, sometimes devastating conversations about, what they were experiencing in their day-to-day and what they were associating with being as a result of the head impacts that they had sustained, earlier in their lives.
This is such a deep conversation. In preparing for our call today, I was, as I usually do, scrolling through Twitter, which is how you and I met. And I saw Chris Nowitzki's retweet of a moment in the Michigan-Ohio State men's basketball game. I don't know if you saw this, but two athletes, one from each team, collided, but not directly, but just sort of brushed heads off. And the guys kind of stood up and shook their heads, and the announcers say, "Oh, he's just shaking off the cobwebs." And you can see that the one player is walking down the court trying to shoot the free throws, and he's shaking his head. He really cannot get his head clear. And one of the things that concerns everybody is, when is the right time to pull somebody, and what is the cultural phenomenon of pulling somebody for an injury that you can't easily see? So how does that moral dilemma really of when do we pull an athlete for his or her safety, and the right thing to do, how does that work in your research?
Yeah, we could spend the whole 30 minutes talking about just this question, I think. Although I hope we don't. There's plenty of other ways we can go. But, there's a lot of layers here. So, first and foremost, if it was visible to people on TV, right, it was probably visible, to the folks on the sidelines, including those who are charged with, serving as healthcare professionals, athletic trainers, or team physicians for those collegiate athletes. And I think, the NCAA gets a lot of criticism, but they have done some real work to try to ensure that there are ways that these healthcare professionals are protected in their decision making capabilities in order to not have the athlete or the healthcare professional face interpersonal, athletic, or career repercussions for making that hard game time decision to say, like, we need to pull this kid, we need to evaluate him or her and make sure that they are safe, and that if they have indeed suffered a concussion, I did not see the video, that we can begin them on the road to recovery. So I think that there are some policy pieces here. They're supposed to be doing that work of pulling it out, pulling the suspected injured athlete out. But there's a lot of interpersonal stuff going on too. I'm sure the athlete, knew something was wrong, but there's a lot of incentives in that environment, both from within the athlete who's probably worked, his or her whole life to get to this point of playing, in a collegiate basketball game. Worried about their athletic prowess at that moment, worried about maybe losing their spot on the team, right? We've done a lot of work to look at the athlete side incentives or disincentives for making that report themselves. And it's hard. We've found in a number of cases, over half of the suspected concussions that athletes face, they don't report for reasons like I just described. So I think we need to think carefully about the roles of institutions and especially healthcare professionals, and in taking that responsibility off of the athlete as much as we can, because of the incentive structure that may prevent them from coming forward in some cases.
I absolutely agree with you. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, and it just, I think, occurred in 2019 or 2020, but finally, I think the NCAA mandated that the athletic trainer or the team doctor has final say over return to play. Why did it take so long, do you think, to get to that point?
I'm not sure why it took so long for them to have that piece of policy in place. Unfortunately, we both know this. Just because you wrote down a policy doesn't mean that things change automatically, right? So even in light of that policy recently coming into place, there's been both research, independent research, as well as a survey from within the National Athletic Training Association itself that has found that there's still these pressures on the healthcare providers from coaches or athletes or both to kind of adjust their medical decision making, right? And it's a tough environment. In the same way that coaches face repercussions if they lose too many games for their careers, there have been, there's evidence that healthcare providers can face career repercussions, even though they shouldn't, if they make these kinds of decisions that are in the athlete's best interests. So it's a tricky space. It's one that I'm really interested in and working on actively, because I do think that there's some real work to do in ensuring that independent medical decision making for the collegiate athletic training and sports medicine staffs.
I agree with you. A couple of years ago, I had the great good fortune of going to see my Philadelphia Eagles play in the Super Bowl in Minneapolis, and they won. I have to point that out. But one of the things that I got to go to before the game was held was something called the First and Future, which is basically a venture capital type of event where the NFL put out some RFPs saying, we're looking for people to help us with technology in certain areas. And that year, the focus was on concussions. And then the focus from there, it was like a Shark Tank. In other words, they had a group of different inventors come forward with their ideas, and then the winner, became the next Shark Tank person or whatever. But the focus that year was on helmet technology, that the NFL is trying to spend a lot of money on trying to invest in better helmets. First, what do you think about that? And second, does that then alleviate them from the problem that we just discussed?
Yeah. I think that the concussion problem, if you want to call it that, and I think concussion is part of it. These repetitive head impacts, whether they result in acute symptoms of concussion, also seem like they may have some of these longer term implications. It's a multi-pronged problem that will probably require a multi-pronged solution.
Okay.
So first, I think focusing strictly on concussion may miss the boat in the ways that I just described. It seems like, again, just science is constantly evolving, but the current evidence seems like it may not just be those acute concussions, those symptomatic head hits that occur, but rather the repetitive hitting of the head, moving of the brain within the skull that can then lead to these later life consequences. And the later life consequences, if we're being pretty honest, have been what has spurred a lot of the attention towards concussion and these innovations that we're moving at.
Right.
With respect to the kind of helmet technology piece, you said, what do I think? I think it's not surprising that the NFL wants, to try to alleviate the problem with better helmets. That would be, were it to work, a very easy solution. But I don't know that physics is on their side. Do I think that we might be able to make some incremental progress in terms of, reducing we can call it like cumulative G-force, or like what is actually experienced in the brain? I imagine that there are some very smart, biomedical engineers who could make some advances there. But is that going to solve the problem? I'm going to say no, because it's just strictly a problem of physics. You're taking very large people moving, pretty quickly and then stopping pretty rapidly, and the forces have to go somewhere. And, the helmet helps disperse the force across the full skull. It was originated back when the problems in football were things much more like cracked skulls or brain bleeds, hematomas, right? So it shifted the problem from those very big, bad brain type injuries that occur with forces that happen over a very small area to dispersing that force over a larger area, but the brain's still moving within the skull. And I don't know that that's ever going to be a problem that we can solve just with technology.
So taking away the helmet, let's take away the sport that doesn't use a helmet. You can think of soccer, you can think of our example of basketball, and even other sports where things happen. What awareness should, especially people who are senior leaders in higher education, people who want to oversee athletics someday, what do they need to understand about the healthcare coverage that athletes should have, and maybe what the institutional policy should be on protecting the health and safety of that athlete?
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of good points here. Let me try to work through them because there's some layers to this question. So one, I do think that there's something to be said about having, from the top down, a real health and safety focus within an institution. We've seen with the case study of concussion, but I'm sure it applies to other injuries, that if important stakeholders like coaches, like sports medicine, directors, athletic trainers come forward and are vocal about having a pro-safety stance, it makes it a lot easier for athletes to seek care when they need it. And so I think that kind of culture of safety is a really important piece. It's hard to, tell people to have a culture of safety, right? What does that mean? I think you have to actually believe it in order for it to come off as genuine. But I think there is that piece. A second piece that you mentioned was the idea of kind of medical coverage. And some of my recent work has focused on just what that looks like across, in this case, specifically NCAA institutions. And we found very wide variation in the number and types of healthcare providers that are available to athletes across these institutions.
Interesting.
So, for example, if we use the athletic trainer, in some cases, the athletic trainer has about 25 athletes to care for on average, a pretty small number if we're just doing kind of strict division at the institutional level.
Right.
In other cases, it's like 500
Wow.
athletes, right? So there's a very stark difference there. And even the most well-meaning clinician would not be able to provide the same level of care in those two contexts, right? So, at kind of a very base level, there is some need for there to be a standard around the minimum acceptable level of care available to these athletes. And we've found in these same studies that, that ratio of athletic trainers to athletes, as well as features about what kinds of clinicians are available, is associated with rates and kinds of injuries that the athletes at those schools experience. So when you have lesser medical coverage, you have more injuries occurring in these schools' athletes. So, it is really a health and safety issue. And so it's something, again, that I continue to work on, to advocate for, to look into, and to research, because it seems like a sort of a fundamental responsibility of these institutions who are fielding the teams that the athletes participate on.
I really agree with you on that. And I think a lot actually about high school athletes that come into the college pipeline who don't have nearly the resources or the structures, or they're playing a lot of club sports, or they're going back and forth, playing year round. How many head injuries do they not even know that they've had, coming into college? And then the first time something happens, the college folks are surprised because they've had this, really outlandish reaction their brain has because they've had a series of smaller and smaller hits. It seems like it's a problem at all levels of sports, not just collegiate.
Absolutely. And there have been some other folks who've done excellent work trying to kind of map the availability of sports medicine providers in high schools or in club sports contexts. And I don't know the exact numbers, but I know the punchline is it's not great. That there are a very significant number of high school and youth athletes who participate in these activities without that safeguard of having a healthcare provider who's charged with ensuring their safety in some ways, right? Who's present at games or practices and those kinds of things. So you're absolutely right. And to kind of put the problem in perspective, that youth and high school athletics is kind of the base of the pyramid. That's where most people are
Yes.
participating, right? It starts to get narrower and narrower as you come up into the college and professional context, where there are plenty more resources available, even if they are quite varied. So, the idea that there are millions of youth and high school athletes who are participating without any kind of medical care available is problematic, especially when we start to think about what that means for kids with different kinds of backgrounds,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It means very different things if you are going home and your parents have healthcare insurance, and if you get an injury, you can go see your established primary care physician. But that is not the reality for many, many people, and it shouldn't be the case that a sport becomes more dangerous strictly because somebody has fewer resources at home. That just does not seem right.
That I couldn't agree with more, and that leads me right into my next question, which is this whole idea of what has happened to healthcare coverage for families in the middle of COVID-19. And we've had massive job losses. Many people have their healthcare insurance through their parents' jobs, one or the other. And so I'm not sure, quite frankly, how many families are actually functioning with typical insurance versus families that are buying insurance that's high deductible, has all kinds of copays and all kinds of high premiums. And these insurance policies do want to know if your kids are playing sports, because that adds to the level of risk. What are your thoughts about this? I sense this is a market that's going to change, maybe for the good in the next few years, but right now I find it to be very tenuous.
Yeah, I think there's, again, a lot going on here. My background and training is in health policy, and so I follow some of this closely. Although I wouldn't say that I'm, just the perfect expert to answer this question. I do think that there's a lot of movement here. My understanding is that the Biden administration is reopening the healthcare marketplaces. So for folks, especially who have lost their insurance coverage due to job loss, they're able to engage with the options provided through the Affordable Care Act's healthcare exchanges. And I also think that there's supposed to be some kind of subsidies available, especially for folks who've lost their jobs. So hopefully all of that plays into helping fix this problem a little bit. I mean, I think you're right that there's all kinds of underlying issues with having health insurance structured through the employer for cases like this, but also just more generally, people switch jobs, they move, and it causes this disruption that might be a little different were the system to be a little bit more universal.
Yeah, and in an economy that's dependent on at least one wage earner, possibly having, multiple part-time jobs to put a full-time salary on the plate, they may not have access to any health care at all. So trying to figure out how to buy health care when you're only working minimum wage jobs, that can be challenging. And that's challenging for kids who are, from lower socioeconomic classes. They may be great athletes, but they may put aside getting health care because they just can't afford it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think, these kind of fundamental inequities and injustices are, big, important societal problems that unfortunately have ramifications pretty much no matter where you look. But, in the case here where we're talking about youth athletes, for sure, right? Your parents lose a job, lose healthcare coverage, you're going to have downstream consequences, whether you realize them immediately or not. Avoiding care for something that seems small can lead to bigger problems. Just in general, the insecurities that come with a lack of job, a lack of healthcare coverage, probably also food insecurities, et cetera. You're right, you're exacerbating existing problems. So it really is, it is a shame. And I do hope that we're able to kind of right the ship on the health insurance front.
Yeah. And I think it's important for senior leaders who are, overseeing athletics to ask questions, to make sure that all of your athletes are being treated equitably when it comes to health and safety, because at the very least, we owe that to them. One team shouldn't get all the benefits and the rest have to kind of pick up the pieces at the end. Another topic that I want to talk to you about, which is where you and I engaged originally, was around one of my passions, which is who owns or controls athlete biometric data? And how can we manage that in an ethically compliant way? So I'd love to get your thoughts as somebody who has thought about this in a moral, ethical sense. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the athlete context is definitely has its unique features, and I'll come there in a second. But more broadly, we are all increasingly kind of engaging in this space where we have something of an idea of where our data is going or not going and who's using it or how they're using it. But it's also a little bit of a black box, right? So I think that there's a lot of challenges in that space broadly about, what do we know or should we know about where our data is going, who has what permissions to use it. And I think in general, people are underinformed, and perhaps companies tend to capitalize on that for their own gains and reselling, reusing, profiting from these data that come typically from, any of the, what's the saying? If you're using something for free, you're not the user, you're the product, right? So your data is in fact the ultimate goal. And so, I think in general, there is that level of issue that gets layered on top of this issue with athletes. And I think we had talked about this particularly in the context of college athletes. And there I see issues being layered on top about, the extent to which the school is capitalizing on their data, the extent to which the athlete feels that they are freely engaged in providing that biometric information, whether that's, sensors or apps or anything like that, or if they feel in any way pressured or coerced to do that. and we've seen that in other contexts, right? We don't want athletes to feel like they need to do something just to maintain a spot, even if it is kind of against their wills otherwise. So I think that those two issues really come into play here. And I think it's exacerbated by the fact that these athletes are already, if we think about men's basketball and men's football in particular, they're creating a lot of, revenues for their institutions, and they are, ostensibly getting a free education, room and board, et cetera. But it's disproportionate in effect in relation to the amount of revenues that they're bringing in for their schools. So if they're yet again being, I'll use the word exploited for their data in addition to their labor, that raises further kind of issues in terms of their relationship to the school and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question for again senior leaders to ask. What is happening with all the sports technology? I mean, that's the latest thing. As far as what technology can I buy for my team that will give us an advantage? And you might get that technology really cheap, but there's a reason you got it really cheap. The data is being sold and collected, and the athletes aren't being given permission. My question would be, as a researcher, do you feel this possibly invades the research space of granting consent, permission to have your data? Should schools actually go through IRB process potentially to gather this kind of data?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of gets back to a pretty fundamental question here is what is the purpose of the data that's being gathered? For what purpose is it being gathered, right? Is it to achieve some kind of competitive advantage ostensibly? Is it to monitor the athletes for some kind of health and safety related issue? Is it something else entirely, right? And so if it's for research purposes, absolutely. And we've seen, I haven't personally conducted, but I know of plenty of researchers who engage with biometric kind of data in the athletics context, and they always have to go through these processes with IRBs, et cetera. And I think that as long as the as long as the athletes are freely and willingly participating in a informed way, and they've agreed, I don't know that there's necessarily inherently any issue with them engaging with these biometric data. But again, we have to come back to, are they freely, willingly, and informedly engaging? And how do we even assess that in some ways in the context that they're in, especially if it's a coach or somebody with kind of power over their athletic future who's asking them to do this. So I just think that we have to be very mindful of the kind of power dynamics here. I want to kind of caveat a lot of the concerns that I've put forward to say, I do think that there are some folks, especially in collegiate sports medicine groups, who are really trying to use these tools to help protect athletes. It's a very kind of new and evolving forefront, but folks are thinking about, how sleep affects athletes' health, well-being, ability to recover. People are trying to use biometric data to understand more about recovery from various orthopedic injuries, right? So there are ways in which it could be, health value, safety enhancing for athletes. But there are also these other ways where it could be abused, misused, or kind of used in a way that is not necessarily in line with the athlete's best interest or well-being. And I think we have to be careful and think through the reasons why we're collecting the data, who ultimately will have access to and use of the data, and ensuring that the athletes do truly have a free kind of informed and willing process for participating in that data collection.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more. And I think it's important, again, for senior leaders to realize you can't have two different standards on each side of the campus. If you got one standard for collecting data for faculty and another standard for athletes, then you've got to, and I just think they have to have their attention brought to it so they can think through what they want to do. Christine, I'm so glad that we could have this really interesting conversation about all the ethical policy and healthcare benefits that uh, senior leaders need to be cognizant of. And we promise to keep our athletes safe when they play sports. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you again for having me and for the opportunity to kind of share some thoughts.
Absolutely. Good luck with the rest of your research.
Thanks so much.